Welcome to a new episode of The Untold with Hebi Buzo. Today we will be talking to Benjamin Weinthal, who is a Berlin-based European correspondent at the Jerusalem Post and a fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Benjamin Weinthal is also a widely published journalist who played a major role in turning the execution of Iranian wrestlers, including Olympic wrestler Navid Afkari, into an internationally recognized story and issue. I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for joining me today, Benjamin. Actually, also, thank you. I even want to say that even your colleagues talked about how persistent you were and continue to be covering the death sentences by the Iranian regime against athletes and wrestlers. Can you tell me about your interest and why do you care so much? I know that you were a wrestler yourself. So tell me a little bit about that personal connection, that personal kind of fellow athlete kind of views on the struggle of these young men who were being sentenced to death by the Iranian regime.
Well, I've covered, I guess, wrestling from, a sort of view a number of years ago where I compared in a Daily News opinion piece, this goes back to 2012, Iran's sort of extremely patient approach to building a nuclear weapons program with the Iranian style of wrestling, which is also sort of very patient, methodical, very developed. And it was, sort of a fun sort of opinion piece that appeared when an American wrestler named Jordan Burroughs competed against an Iranian wrestler at the 2012 Olympics in London, and the American won. And there was a lot of hype about this wrestling match. So that's when I first delved back into wrestling. I do have a wrestling background, as you mentioned. I was a high school wrestler in New York State, where wrestling is enormously popular as a high school and junior high school sport. And I then competed as a collegiate wrestler and for New York University in New York City, and was the university's first All-American wrestler, which means that you placed in the national tournament in the top 8, and I placed twice in the top 8. I placed 8th place, so I wiggled my way in and secured All-American status. And this is going back over 30 years ago when I was a student, and then I reacquainted myself with wrestling recently. I guess largely because of my interest in sports that was now online, I guess. There was an opportunity to watch a lot of these events where in the pre-internet world, there wasn't that type of opportunity. It was non-existent. So the case of Navid Afkari, the Olympic or the champion Greco-Roman wrestler from Iran, who was an Olympic caliber wrestler, as you noted, because wrestling in Iran is a national pastime. It's the functional equivalent in the United States of basketball and baseball and football. That's how popular the sport is in Iran. That caught the slated execution of Navid Afkari, this wrestler, in late August in Iran, caught my attention. I believe Radio Free Europe, or Radio Farda, excuse me, a US government website, first published an article about it, but I had seen on social media some chatter about Iran's about to execute an athlete, a wrestler who merely participated in a demonstration against the fundamental political and economic corruption of the Islamic Republic in 2018. The regime claimed that he killed a Basij military member who was charged with tracking demonstrators monitoring the demonstrators and reporting them to the regime. But human rights organizations and Western governments, including the United States, believe that those were trumped up. That was a trumped up charge. Navid, in his own statement, said that he was brutally tortured and forced to confess, and that this whole trial was a sham process. And the reason Iran's regime targeted him, Navid Afkari, was he had the ability, because he was a very decorated wrestler, in the art of Greco-Roman wrestling, which means, I won't go too deep in the weeds here about wrestling, but it means you only use your upper body. You're not allowed to, under the Greco-Roman wrestling rules, you're not allowed to attack your opponent's legs, but you're only allowed to attack your opponent from the waist up, which means you can throw your opponent, toss him or her, because women also compete in wrestling in the Olympics. The Americans have a number of very decorated women wrestlers. It's a growing sport. Many folks don't know that. And the Iranian regime was in a state of panic because they knew that Navid's case could mobilize the masses. That is, ordinary Iranians who seek a democratic future and seek the dissolution of the Islamic State. These large swaths of the population could mobilize against the regime around Navid Afkari and threaten the livelihood, the preservation, the very preservation of the regime. So that's why this case became a cause célèbre. And I know, President Trump then tweeted.
That's what I wanted to talk about, Benjamin. You kept writing about this story about Navid Afkari, and that was before his execution. Until one day, the story was finally picked up by the State Department and the White House. It was also tweeted by President Trump, which made the story from a local story. I mean, the Iranian regime executes people in Iran. It's probably one of the highest countries in the world to carry on death sentences, obviously, with no fair trials, no evidence, nothing. It's enough that this person is a minority, or that it speaks against the regime or is critical of the regime, it will be disappeared and then executed. But this turned into an internationally recognized story. People were talking about it everywhere. You played a major role in this. Can you tell me, how did this happen?
Well, you're right that, my understanding is that Iran's regime is the second leading state with respect to the number of executions. And of course, as you mentioned, Iran's judicial system is, lacks any semblance of due process and fair play or modernized judicial standards. And there are, as you point out correctly, there are executions happening every day. Just the other day, I'm working on a new story about a young Iranian Kurd who was executed, I believe yesterday or the day before. I'm trying to secure more information. He may have also been an athlete. So these types of cases are run of the mill in Iran, and it's in the media. Many media organizations just zone out because they get into the mode of habituation. Well, this is the norm in Iran. Executions, extrajudicial killings are, part and parcel of the regime's inner workings, and it happens every day. Why should we report on this? It's just, it's not news, but it is news. And Afkari, of course, and I've reported on executions over the years in Iran and human rights abuses. So this is my sort of beat, so to speak. But the Afkari thing, as you mentioned, had resonated with me because of because I had some skin in the game, I guess, as a former collegiate wrestler, and I understood. Well, I know, wrestling is sort of a special community, and there's a special ethos because the sport is so demanding. And when an athlete reaches the level of Navid Afkari's level, it certainly can. You understand as a former wrestler that you're dealing with a very elite individual who's reached heights that very few athletes in the wrestling community can reach. So I did continue to write these articles starting in late August for the Jerusalem Post and FoxNews.com, and I was seeking comments from different government officials. My article in FoxNews.com was titled "Iran's regime, I believe, imposes 2 death sentences on champion wrestler," something along the lines of that. I don't remember the exact headline, but the headline captured the fact that the regime imposed 2 death sentences on Afkari. So we were dealing with a situation where it was a very tall order to secure a stay. That is, from the opponents of the death penalty, it would be a very uphill battle for the opponents to secure a stay on Afkari's execution because of the 2 death penalties. President Trump at the time, who's interested in wrestling, he seems, I mean, he's interested in both the sort of professional wrestling, which is not real, authentic wrestling, the fake wrestling, that has a high entertainment value, but he's also interested in amateur wrestling or Olympic wrestling. And I've noticed that over the years that he's tweeted about wrestling, and it's one of his hobbies, I guess.
Mhm.
And he was advised, as I understand it, by someone in his cabinet and about the Afkari case. In the Oval Office, I was told this meeting took place. My article was presented to him, and he quoted from it about the worsening inflation in Iran. That is the reason Afkari was executed, because he protested against worsening in economic inflation in Iran. And Trump appealed to the leaders of the Islamic Republic to reverse the execution. That, I think, was on the first week of September. Afkari was executed on September 12th, and along with Donald Trump, Dana White, who's the head of the UFC, this mixed martial arts federation, who has, I think, over 5 or 6 million followers on Twitter. He's a very enormously popular figure within mixed martial arts, also made a video and appealed. And once Trump's tweet helped create this global campaign to reverse the execution, things then got, you had all these Olympic wrestlers from all over the world, all these prestigious athletes weighing in, some governments also weighing in. And as you mentioned, the story, because of the tweets and the nature of this case, blanketed the media.
I do remember that also you wrote about human rights organizations and obviously the International Olympic Committee, the United World Wrestling Organization. Those are, I mean, very important for every athlete to have the support, especially an Olympic champion, have the support from the
Yeah.
international. You tried to get them to make a statement, and tell me about the response. How responsive were they? How supportive were they of a fellow athlete like Navid? While he was still alive, there was still a chance for them to help save him.
Rob Kohler, who's the head of Global Athlete, a sports advocacy organization that promotes the rights of athletes, and Rob is highly critical of the Olympics because the Olympics over the years has not honored its pledge to support the human rights of athletes. And he and other sports advocacy or advocates of athletes' rights were extremely critical, because the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, United World Wrestling, both these very powerful sports organizations, both of whom work together. Um, when I contacted them before Navid's murder, and that I think it's important to note, based on the evidence and the statements, Iran's regime murdered Navid Afkari, and the IOC and the UWW. I contacted them with a quote from the former acting director of national intelligence in the United States, Rick Grinnell, who told me, and he obviously is a very important figure. He was he oversaw all the U.S. intelligence agencies during the Trump administration. He told me at that time that the Olympics has to intervene here, and he urged them to take action. So I contacted them and sent a press query, and my sense was this was the first time, based on my press query and Rick Grinnell's statement, that they had heard about the case, even though there were reports out there, and they said they wrote me back and they said they were looking into it. What we later found out after the execution took place on September 12th, the IOC and the UWW issued statements, and the statement is still on the website of the Olympics, that they regret that Iran's government executed Navid Afkari, and they worked, and this, I'm quoting them, behind the scenes to bring about a stay of the execution. And they sent letters. Thomas Bach, who's the head of the Olympics, sent letters to, I believe, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, and the president, Hassan Rouhani. And so their efforts were, all behind the scenes, which is it plays into Iran's politics, because there's no pressure. If, in my view, when you're dealing with a totalitarian regime that's the leading state sponsor of international terrorism, according to the Obama and Trump administrations, sending letters is really not going to influence a change in their behavior about a pending execution of a at that point a national icon in Iran, but also a cause célèbre internationally. So what could have, in my view, and I'm fairly sanguine about this, what could have reversed the execution was if the IOC, President Thomas Bach, and the president of the Wrestling Federation had announced publicly prior to the murder of Afkari that we will exclude you from all international wrestling competition. If Bach had gone further and said, we will exclude you from all Olympic competition if you execute this wrestler, and the suspension will be indefinite, that in my analysis, based on my writing, my experience with the Islamic Republic over the last 15, 16 years, would have stopped the murder. But so in the end, the IOC and the Wrestling Federation, according to critics, failed miserably. They took a lot of criticism, and they still haven't taken any action against against two more killings of decorated Iranian athletes over the last in January of this year.
To me, as a journalist, as somebody who watched this happen and unfold, it's absolutely horrendous to see that these organizations are so cold. They represent these athletes, that they have an obligation and a responsibility to do what they can to protect the lives of innocent athletes that are being persecuted by a terrorist-sponsored regime. The fact that they wouldn't even issue a statement putting these conditions, that you are, as a state, are not allowed to send other athletes to come on your behalf and participate in our sports, if you go ahead and execute this athlete. I mean, that was a very simple thing. In your opinion, why is it that they just don't see that they have this moral obligation, this responsibility towards other athletes?
Well, I think the IOC and the Wrestling Federation are, I mean, the critics say they're feeble, they're embroiled in corruption. These large sports organizations don't want to pick fights with countries, especially a radical Islamic theocracy. And a lot of it is just simply the standard, approach that the games must go on regardless of what happens. There could be, take the case of China. I think 180 human rights groups the other day just called on the Olympics to not allow the games to take place in China in 2022 because of China's genocide targeting
Genocide
its
against the Uyghurs.
minority,
Hmm.
yeah, minority population. So
Exactly,
there is,
Muslim minority. Hmm.
right, there is a backlash, but again, you're dealing with a very powerful sports organization. In the end, I suspect, unless the Olympic sponsors like Coca-Cola, Asics, which is a Japanese company that produces wrestling shoes, by the way, which I used to wear as an athlete, or Airbnb. I mean, there's a whole list. Visa, I think, is also a sponsor of the Olympics. If these organizations start to pull the plug on their support and say enough is enough with China, communist China, and Iran, then there might be some fundamental changes. Because one example, the International Hockey Federation recently pulled out of Belarus because the dictator there, Lushenko, who
Yeah.
engaged in massive election fraud
Yeah,
last
that
year.
our name should not be endorsing or supporting in any way these type of regimes.
Right.
Period.
And the key with the international hockey event that was supposed to be held in Belarus was the sponsors put pressure on. I mean, people put pressure on the sponsors, and the sponsors said, no, we're not going to participate in Belarus. And the International Hockey Organization pulled out. So this, and it's, I don't think with the Olympics and Thomas Bach, the current head, who's from Germany, who's also has been involved in, they say, some graft with foreign countries before he became head of the IOC. I think a lot of this deals with, and including the Wrestling Federation, it's not anything more intellectually complex than these high-level figures, managers and the presidents, simply don't care. They simply don't care about human life, the lives of athletes who are being, as you mentioned, persecuted in highly repressive countries. And my feeling also is this is one of the most underreported areas of journalism, especially sports journalism, and underreported and non-reported, namely the widespread or ubiquitous corruption within these very powerful sports organizations.
Exactly. And that could also be added to other international organizations, which we'll get to a little bit later in our conversation. This is a crisis, basically, that the world is going through, where all these organizations are corrupt and falling from within. Yet we're all, kind of sitting and watching. It's just something that has to change.
And
Um, but
I would add that, post Navid's murder, the U.S. government in late September was the only government to sanction prison and judicial officials who were involved in the murder of Navid Afkari. The EU did not sanction any of the prison and human and judicial officials involved in the murder. The EU, like the Wrestling Federation and the IOC, issued a a condemnation that has no impact on Iran's behavior. So the only penalty Iran suffered was from the U.S. side, and then there was just a string of, as I mentioned, condemnations from other governments, and this type of conduct, where punitive measures are not involved, only emboldened Iran's regime to execute 2 additional athletes since Navid's murder.
We're going to continue to talk about this. I wanted to ask you, you've reported on many other athletes. I mean, how many wrestlers so far? And I actually read an article that you wrote too about a boxer that was tortured and sentenced to die by the Iranian regime. So what is the total here?
We're talking, as of right now, there's been, since September 12th, 2020 until late January, so roughly within that, I guess, 4-month period, Iran executed 3 athletes, 2 wrestlers. The second wrestler's name is Mehdi Ali Hosseini, and as you mentioned, a boxer, also in January of this year, an Iranian Arab boxer whose name is Ali Muteri. Forgive me if I'm butchering his last name. He was also, like Navid Afkari, involved in protests against the regime, and is believed to have been, based on reporting from Iran International, an Iranian news organization based in London that does a lot of very good reporting and has some good sourcing on the ground in Iran. According to Iran International, the boxer was, like Navid Afkari, was severely tortured and forced to confess to a crime he didn't commit.
I don't even know of other journalists who continue to highlight this and why this is so important. Not only these people are athletes, the loss of potential, the loss of opportunity that they've had. Obviously, the other fact is like the sadistic intention behind this regime. Are they targeting athletes and wrestlers because they want to kill that hope and the spirit of triumph? Why are they focusing on that, in your opinion?
That's an excellent question. And that's a question I think a lot of journalists with whom I've had contact, sports journalists, are struggling with, and myself included. My struggling to I guess provide a comprehensive answer. I think the most compelling answer is Iran's regime is obviously in decline. They've been crippled by U.S. sanctions. They faced a massive protest in 2019 against the very nature, the very foundation of the regime. The regime's response to that protest was to murder roughly 1,500 Iranians, including children, according to a Reuters investigation, and arrest, I believe, as many as 10,000 people, again, including children. And then you, of course, had demonstrations going back in 2017, 2018 against the foundation of the regime, against the whole Ali Khamenei system. So these wrestlers and the boxer, at least 2 of these athletes we know were involved in protests against the regime. And when you have a wrestler and a boxer against sports that are championed in Iran, that are valued, especially wrestling, where as I mentioned, when you talk to Iranians, and I've had many conversations, they tell me about which family members wrestled, and they know the names of all their elite wrestlers. It's just part of the state of being in Iran. And also, I would add, wrestling is a very working class sport, so it reaches, it's an inexpensive sport. I mean, obviously you need a wrestling mat, but you don't need a lot of equipment. You need headgear, but even you don't even need headgear, because the type of wrestling that the Iranians use is international wrestling. You don't require headgear like you do in the US for collegiate wrestling. So you basically just need wrestling shoes and a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and that's it, and a wrestling mat. And so it appeals to wrestlers. Navid came from a poor background. He worked as a plasterer while competing as a wrestler. So it shows you how he was trying to make ends meet. As someone who was a champion wrestler in Iran, he also had to work as a plasterer. It shows you how bad the conditions are there. And these wrestlers, I would argue, in the case of Navid, and also the boxer, of course, and other athletes who have been executed over the years in Iran. There have been previous wrestlers who have been executed going back to the 80s, and including women athletes who have been executed. These athletes have the potential, the enormous potential, as I believe, to mobilize the Iranian population against the regime. And we saw some of this in response to Navid's murder, where there were some, perhaps fireworks were used, some type of small level, not, I wouldn't say explosives, but fireworks, or lighting some debris on fire in front of the prison where he was, or the judicial complex where he was executed. There was graffiti that was written in support of Navid in Iran. And this is at a time where one has to remember that just the year before, in 2019, engaged in one of the bloodiest outbreaks, the regime of suppression. 1,500 people were murdered just for peacefully protesting. So there's also the concern that these wrestlers, these elite athletes, could breed confidence to demonstrate against the regime. And in the case of Afkari, there was this mounting global campaign where you had athletes across the world, elite Olympic athletes. You had Western governments like Britain, Germany, who provided a statement to me when I asked, opposed the execution, even though they didn't issue any sanctions. In Britain, a minister opposed the execution of Afkari, but again, Britain didn't issue any sanctions. And a member of the Azerbaijan parliament told me that Iran should not execute Afkari. This was all prior to the execution, of course. So this movement was creating a broad-based, I guess, campaign internationally that could have also spilled over into Iran and created more demonstrations, because Iran's a highly volatile country. Many people still recall the demonstrations in 2009, the so-called Green Movement against the fraudulent re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So I think has the best explanatory power as to why there seems to be a targeting of these athletes. And I suspect it will continue unless the sports organizations intervene.
You also covered the abuse of the Iranian regime, obviously to many different ethnic and religious minorities in Iran, but also the LGBT community in Iran. An Iranian clerk, Ayatollah Abbas Tabrizan, wrote in his Telegram social media platform, "Don't go near those who have had the COVID vaccine. They have become homosexuals." That's what he wrote. But you've included so many other information about the systematic abuse of the gay and lesbian community in Iran. Tell us a little bit more. I mean, not to mention, obviously, that according to one of the activists that you quoted, she said that the Iranian officials took Pfizer, the Western, vaccine, but then they, deprived their own people from getting any vaccination. So tell me a little bit more about the LGBT community and how they're treated by the Iranian regime.
Yeah, that was an interesting comment from Shaina, who's a Iranian dissident who lives in Germany, who follows, her homeland quite closely. It just shows you the corruption involved in the regime and its accumulation of wealth at the expense of the pharmaceutical products at the expense of the population. The LGBT, I've been writing about the persecution of Iranian the LGBT community in Iran since roughly 2010, and I wrote an article actually for a newspaper in New York called Gay City News where I also contribute articles to, and it's the largest LGBT newspaper in the United States. And I called in 10 years ago for sanctions against the Iranian regime because of its genocidal activity targeting the LGBT community. That op-ed caused some controversy, but because I use the word genocide, but it clearly is a genocide because Iran's policy is to, based on its Sharia law system, is to murder gays and lesbians. That's what's codified in their law system. And they have executed between 4,000 and 6,000 gays and lesbians since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, according to a 2008
Wow.
British WikiLeaks cable. So the number is probably significantly higher. Obviously, that cable only went until 2008, and I've reported on the execution of gays and lesbians in Iran since 2010, including in 2019. That was the last open source information I got out of Iran, when Iran executed a man based on an anti-gay charge, hanged him based on an anti-gay charge.
Can I detour here for a minute, Benjamin? Before we continue on with this topic, I just want to say that you also covered the war in Syria in the beginning. You went there, you interviewed people, you went to the areas that were very dangerous. Tell me about, your coverage of that war. What year was it? What have you witnessed?
I was assigned to go to the Syria-Turkish border in 2013, during the time when right after the chemical weapons attacks that Assad used against his population, and Obama announced that there would be retaliatory strikes if Assad crossed his famous red line, and that is Obama's red line. Excuse me. And I was assigned in anticipation that the Americans and the British were going to, and the French were going to launch missiles against Assad.
The so-called red line by Obama.
Correct. That if Assad, crosses this so-called red line and uses chemical weapons against his population, the U.S. will respond with force. Obama, of course, did not abide by his own red line, and I was already in Turkey, and then I decided to use the time to interview Syrian refugees and try to find, and report on other stories. So my original assignment, as I mentioned, was to report on the actual military strikes that were planned. That was canceled. That turned into a big disaster, as we all know. People across the Middle East viewed Obama.
So you found yourself found yourself there. There was nothing for you to report because the White House backed off on implementing the red line. Mm-hmm.
Correct, because my primary focus was the actual planned military response that didn't take place, which in the end emboldened the Assad regime, and the Assad regime continued to use chemical weapons against its population, even though Obama and Kerry claimed they had negotiated an agreement with Assad's regime to confiscate all of his chemical warfare machinery and his poison, and of course that turned out to be a giant theater of the absurd, this whole plan. And I then decided, okay, I'm in Gaziantep in Turkey. I went to Kilis, it's a city right on the border of Syria and Turkey, and I, with my fixer, whose name was Mahmoud, who helped translate. Unfortunately, I don't speak Arabic. In contrast to you, Avi, I envy your Arabic skills, as you know. I was helped by this teacher. He was an English teacher in Aleppo. His name was Mahmoud, as I mentioned, who translated, and I spent a lot of time interviewing refugees outside of this, Syrian refugees outside of this camp in Kilis, who were sleeping outside. They weren't actually in the. So I interviewed Syrians who were living outside of a refugee camp. There was a massive refugee camp where the conditions weren't atrocious, but obviously it's a refugee camp. It's you know, you're dealing with a dilapidated way of living and an existence that's inhumane. But the refugees who were outside of the camp were living in, you know, it was basically a shanty town. There were, you know, tents. People were sleeping in, you know, within a garbage strewn field. Debris, garbage was everywhere. The children were filthy. There were toilets outside. I didn't see any showers. And I went from basically to family to individuals and conducted these interviews, asking their views about the conflict, who was responsible, what can be done to solve the conflict. I remember one man, a farmer from Idlib, from the province, who you know, told me about his experience, and he was a grown man who just broke down crying about what he experienced and his efforts to in his time in Syria and the Assad's scorched earth policy against the campaign, against the pro-democracy campaign, because this was a relatively early period. Remember, it's going back to 2013. So the revolution in Syria started in 2011, and you know, it hadn't been completely, I guess, co-opted by a lot of the jihadi groups and Muslim Brotherhood groups. There were still segments of the revolt that you know, were not in the business of wanting to create an Islamic State within Syria. So, and then we crossed over. I then connected with some Germans who were doing a film for a television station. We drove along the Syrian Turkish border and crossed over the border into Jarablus. So I didn't go deep into the city, just crossed over the border and was among a lot of Syrians who were trying to enter and trying to cross over to the Turkish side, I believe, because there was a lot of traffic at that time going back and forth between the border that was shut down actually. When I crossed over, it was about to shut down, so I had to go back across. And you know, there's a lot. There's no shortage of stories. I mean, I did see some what would appear to be radical Islamists crossing over this very porous border into
From
Syria,
Turkey, right?
into Turkey, from Turkey into Syria.
Into Syria, yeah.
Yeah, because the Turks were allowing, and that was my experience when I was there. There wasn't any real crackdown on Islamists who crossed over into Syria. Their Gaziantep, where I stayed after coming back, was filled with you know, a lot of jihadists who had wide latitude to do what they wanted in Gaziantep. And this was a time, it's hard to remember, but because it's going back 8 years for people who follow this. I mean, they do remember it, but it was a time when the Islamic State was just crystallizing, it was forming. So in Jarablus, the Islamic State was present, and also in you know, if you crossed over on your way to Aleppo from Kilis, if you took that direct route, you would be in Islamic State territory. But at the time, it was called ISIS, and there were scattered reports coming in that there's this new jihadi movement that is formed in northern Syria. It's called ISIS, and these reports are coming in, and I knew obviously this was dangerous, and I didn't want to go near this group called ISIS. And then, of course, the ISIS rapidly increased its power within a short period of time and took over, large swaths of Syria and Iraq and created a caliphate.
And it became, I
So
mean, the most dangerous place for a journalist. That's why it's really dangerous and risky what you did, because we know that there's many journalists who just vanished.
yeah. I mean, there were risks, but again, I tried to keep my presence on the Turkish side of the border most of the time, and there was, it's always, it can be dodgy at times, but I've had experience in conflict zones in the past, so I think I proceed with caution,
Mhm.
and and I also went to a lot of the military installations across Turkey where the U.S. Patriot missiles were, and spoke with Turkish soldiers and Dutch soldiers, German soldiers who were monitoring these radar equipment and Patriot missiles. What I found really disturbing at one point was one of the installations, and one of the soldiers told me he could watch all the missiles that Assad was launching at Aleppo at the civilian locations and did nothing because of it was a purely defensive installment in Turkey with the Patriot missiles to stymie, to intercept any artillery, any missiles coming from Syria, but they weren't able to intervene, as we know, in the actual conflict on Syrian soil. So he could actually, and he showed me the monitor where you could see, in what he had viewed, and to his frustration, the actual Syrian missiles. I would assume that might include barrel bombs, all sorts of air power strikes against innocent civilians, and the West just monitored it along with the Turks. And we're at over 500,000 deaths right now. As I think you had mentioned to me at one point, the UN actually stopped counting the deaths, you told me. So who knows what the real number is? It's over 500,000, but we don't know the total number of deaths. So it was, and I mean, the reporting was helpful in terms of trying to, I think, show the complexity of the massacres and the refugee crisis, and then I also did some interviews of Syrian refugees who were living in Bulgaria. I was in Bulgaria twice, and went to their where they were being housed, and interviewed Syrian. A Yazidi family, or Yazidi, a young Yazidi boy.
Yes, and they were massacred by ISIS.
Yeah, and this was at the time before the massacre, and then I interviewed some Syrian, I think Kurds, Syrian Arabs, non-Kurdish Syrians.
And I mean,
And
from this point, it was like just many just conflicting policies. Turkey just wanted to fight with the Kurds and supported Islamists, and the United States was pulling out, wasn't as interested under the Obama administration. A red line in the sand, the whole thing. We saw what happened. But then we've had the Trump administration, and we've seen that the Trump administration at least kind of kept its word about the chemical weapons attack. At the same time, there was the maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime. Israel confronted the Iranian elements and Hezbollah who were encroaching on its borders. And now we have the Biden administration. People are concerned. There are many signs of where things could be heading under this administration. In your opinion, how worried should people be seeing the appointments that we've seen in the State Department? Now, for example, the Houthis were designated a terrorist organization. The Biden administration said, no, we're going to undesignate them. And then there is the nuclear question.
Well, yeah, I mean, you packed a lot into that question. You covered a lot of territory.
It's a multiple questions in one, but, address it as you please.
Yeah, I mean, you make, again, you highlight points that people tend to forget quickly, and that is the Trump administration did launch two strikes, military strikes against the Assad regime for its usage of chemical warfare, poison gas against its own population. So it's to its credit, or there was a deterrent military action unleashed against the Assad regime by the Americans. I would have preferred more strikes, and strikes from more countries should have been involved. Um, but that didn't happen. The question about the new administration and its personnel, I think what we're seeing are a number of unsettling policies and personnel uh, personnel appointments. You mentioned the U.S. just a few days ago delisted or announced that they're going to delist, which is the same thing. The Houthi movement, the Iranian-backed Houthi movement in Yemen, from the list of foreign terrorist organizations. Excuse me. That's a mistake, simply because the U.S. government could continue to list the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization while providing humanitarian aid to the Yemeni population. The reason that Secretary of State Blinken and others within the Biden administration delisted the Houthis is because they said, with the listing of the Houthis as a terrorist organization, the U.S. and other entities won't be able to provide humanitarian aid. That's nonsense, because there are waivers, and the U.S. government and NGOs can provide aid to NGOs in Yemen without the Houthis being delisted as a terrorist organization. I mean, the U.S. lists Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization, but the U.S. provides aid to Lebanon, provides aid to the Lebanese army. So it only, this delisting sends a message to Iran, which backs the Houthis, and it could be construed, in my view, as a form of Saudi appeasement toward Iran's regime and also the Houthis. So it's certainly something that's unsettling and was completely superfluous. The second, I think, mistake was the U.S. government is now re-entered the United Nations Human Rights Council, has re-entered it after the Trump administration pulled out because of the council's record of anti-Semitism and support for dictatorships across the world.
And
And the
I was
U.S.
going to
has,
get to that because this is another major scandal on its own, resuming that they just unconditional support to these organizations. But let's
that,
talk about the Iran question first.
sure. I think that's a good point that you mentioned, the unconditional support in terms of the delisting of the Houthis, because experts in the Yemen field, one expert I know, a woman, tweeted about this, the fact that the U.S. did not secure any concessions from Iran and the Houthis. The Houthis were simply delisted as a terrorist organization without any conditions, as you mentioned, and that's just, I don't understand that type of foreign policy. It doesn't make sense, in terms of trying to advance U.S. security interests and reduce terrorism in that part of the world. The Islamic Republic of Iran is also front and center in the Biden administration's thinking. What I see happening here is a drift or a return to the Obama era policy, where the Biden administration wants to re-enter this very flawed nuclear agreement called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that allows Iran, after a certain period of time, to build a nuclear weapon, because there's a clause in it, in the language of contracts, a sunset clause, that after a certain date, Iran can continue to enrich uranium, and that allows the country, the regime, to build a nuclear weapon. It's a deal that will increase nuclear armed states in the region, in this volatile region, and it doesn't stop Iran from building an atomic weapon. And the U.S. government at this time wants to return to that deal that all the moderate countries in the Middle East, Israel, are vehemently opposed to and view Iran as a threat, an existential threat to their security. So I don't understand why the Biden administration would want to return to a deal that advances Iran's jingoism at the expense of its allies' security. And the Biden administration shows you my Freudian slips here, because people say that the Biden administration's foreign policy is just an act two of the Obama administration. So I keep saying Obama when I mean Biden. So it's apologies for the Freudian slip. The appointment, for example, of the Iran envoy, Robert Malley, was also viewed by many critics, including important Iranian dissidents in the US and across the world, as against the goals of the dissident community and Iranian Democrats who are in Iran. Namely, Malley is viewed as someone who's aligned with the Islamic Republic of Iran and its agenda, and is involved in the business of appeasing and placating the rulers of Iran at the expense of Iranians. So that's in terms of Iran, what we're seeing are some very, very disturbing developments that don't bode well, I think, for Middle East regional security, and it doesn't bode well for European and American security, because if you continue to provide, as the Iran nuclear deal does, billions and billions and billions of dollars in oil proceeds to Iran, if you lift these sanctions, the oil and gas sanctions, Iran will use that money, and it has previously used the money during the Obama administration to finance terrorism, finance Hezbollah, finance the Houthis, and finance other proxies in the region.
And not give one penny to its people. I mean, definitely the people will continue to suffer even more when the sanctions were lifted on the Iranian regime.
Right.
Obama
I
administration.
mean, that's what we saw in 2015 once the Iran nuclear deal was reached. During the Obama period, the sanctions were released. There was a massive infusion of cash, billions of dollars. And what we saw from the time that Trump pulled out of the deal in 2018, between 2015 and 2018, was Iran's sponsorship of terrorism. And as you noted, no appreciable increase in the quality of living for ordinary Iranians. There was
the opposite.
worker.
Yeah.
So again, why there's a fundamental misreading of the Iranian regime, where the Europeans and the Biden administration believe they can incentivize Iran's regime with cash to bring about a change in its behavior. Mm-hmm. That has failed miserably over 40 years since the Islamic Republic was created. Engaging in trade with the Iran regime in order to bring about change was a sort of a German foreign ministry philosophy that failed back in the 80s, and we've seen no change, because Iran's system is based on a revolutionary ideology that seeks expansionism, and that's what we see in the Middle East right now. Iranian expansionism in Iraq, where it uses its funds to support Shiite militias who seek to murder American service
and personnel. Assassinations of every human rights activist, of every person who criticized them publicly. This is happening now on a very wide level in Lebanon and in Iraq. It's been happening, but now in Lebanon increasingly, which is really just heartbreaking to see what's happening. And now we're seeing that there's a new kind of engagement with the Iran regime. I mean, to me, I just wanted to ask your opinion on this. I know we're getting closer to being out of time, but I did want to ask you, Benjamin, about the intense coverage that we're hearing right now of the so-called elections in Iran. I'm one of those people who've been watching what's happening in Iran. I truly, as somebody who is from the region, covering these wars and what the Iranian regime has been doing and what type of regime that is, that, the presidential elections, and the fact that there is the conservatives or the not conservatives, the hardliners, I'm translating it from Arabic, and the so-called reformists is non-existent. I am personally, I don't see why should we care about those elections coming up in Iran. What's your take on this?
I concur with you. I don't see a separation between what many in academia and many in the Western press and many in Western governments classify as the hardliners versus the reformers, as you noted. I think right now, we just have all hardliners, just and who embrace a system that doesn't allow women to run for president, that embraces a system where Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, selects all the presidential candidates and excludes those who deviate even millimeters from the Islamic Revolutionary Party line. So it's a big farce in that sense, and it only these elections are sort of similar to what we experienced in the former Soviet Union, or the country that I've studied a lot, the former East German communist state, the German Democratic Republic. I mean, its name was the German Democratic Republic, right? But it was a one-party system. The Socialist Party ran the system, but there were a few parties that allegedly participated in the election that to create this illusion that the East German communist state was a democracy, and that's the same procedure and the same program in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I just wish that that journalists would who cover Iran and make these distinctions would at least show another voice or another point of view, especially from Iranian dissidents or those Iran-based dissidents, or experts like yourself from the region who know Iran because of Iran's influence in Syria, and would at least present that perspective. It's only a couple sentences in a dispatch or in a television broadcast to show, well, there are those who argue, that this is a distinction without a difference, and can make that point about the false narrative of hardliners versus reformists, because I think that's critical to contemporary reporting on Iran, and we rarely see that type of nuance in articles. Yet, the Iranian dissidents, prominent Iranian dissidents, and many prominent Middle Eastern reporters are constantly making that point, but it somehow is not doesn't end up in a lot of the in I would argue in most of the Western news dispatches and reports.
Yep. Unfortunately, I mean, definitely this is a major problem about the disconnect between what's covered and what's actually happening. And I think this echoes with the entire Middle East coverage is completely in disconnect when it comes to Western media, which is a very important topic on its own. But now I also want to go to international organizations. And this is something that has been coming up more and more. It's more and more evident every day. One of these good policies that the previous administration has done is basically stop American support to international organizations who were not being productive and getting the job that they were made for done, and they were compromised by authoritarian regimes, which prevents them from being actually a functioning organizations, not to mention the corruption allegations. And that includes, we can cover many things. But, we just talked about the fact that the Biden administration decided to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council, which is, to many people who are watching, I mean, this is a ridiculous joke. And I'm not going to, hide my opinion about this, because when you see Venezuela on that organization. China, and we know that there's a genocide being committed against the Muslim Uyghurs, and they are on that council. It's outrageous. Why are we doing this? Why are we supporting this? Why did we rejoin the World Health Organization when we know what happened in January and February with the pandemic, and them covering up and not sharing what was going on with the United States and the rest of the world? So what is the answer to these questions? It's concerning just to see that there's no trust between the common man and these organizations that are supposed to be there to help countries. They're just not doing their job. They're compromised by dictatorships that are taking over them. So, I mean, I know this is a big question, but now we're seeing that this administration is kind of returning to this old system that was just not working, and it's wasting our taxpayer money. What is your opinion?
I think multilateral organizations, some can be effective. There are some, obviously multilateral alliances are very important. I think in terms of the UN Human Rights Council, I think this is an area where, I mean, putting aside whether, the whole Trump controversy and whether you intensely dislike him or like him, or, putting that aside, this organization has been heavily criticized by many administrations, and George W. Bush, if I remember correctly, pulled out of this human rights body. I think it had a different name at that time, and so Trump and his ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council and described it as, as a sort of a, she used Nikki Haley used as ambassador to the UN, used very colorful language and describing the organization as sort of a cesspool of hatred and pro dictatorship policies. And the council could be reformed, or there's a chance, I should say, if a coalition of powerful Western governments with allies, with other democratic allies, decided simply, we're all going to pull out of this organization and dismantle it. It's a complete mess. We need to build a new entity from the ground up where dictatorships and non-democratic regimes do not have influence. And I think the only way to do it, to reform the organization, is to engage in a wholesale revision. And that's not what the Biden administration is doing. The Biden administration is taking, again, this approach that if we're within the Human Rights Council, we can reform it. Actually, you can't. That's been tried multiple times and it failed. So it's the Albert Einstein's theory of clinical insanity, where you keep doing the same thing over and over and not getting the result you desire. So that's basically what we're seeing, in my view, with the Human Rights Council. And for the reasons you listed, and you listed these countries, China, as you noted, is committing a genocide. And other countries that have had or do have a role at the Human Rights Council, Venezuela, are engaged in just atrocious human rights violations. And most of the time, they're concerned with singling out democracies for sanctions and criticism, like the United States, like Israel. So I see this as a total waste of time on the part of the U.S. And they would better use their resources if they mobilized an alliance, as I said, of sort of, what's been called moral majority countries that are not anti-democratic and meet the criteria of being advanced, or meet the criteria of being liberal capitalist democracies that don't gut human rights protections in their own countries. If those countries would stand up and you have this type of robust alliance, there's a chance you could build a new organization that would protect that would seek to advance human rights causes around the world. But what did the UN Human Rights Council do for the case of Navid Afkari and all these other athletes that have been executed in the Islamic Republic? I sent them questions before the UN before the last execution of in January of the wrestler Mehdi Ali Hosseini. Do you plan to intervene? Will you condemn this? Zero.
Exactly.
They just said we're against the death penalty. They wouldn't even, the UN wasn't even in the position to say Iran should not execute this wrestler. And of course, they did nothing in terms of the case of Navid Afkari. And I don't recall any human rights statements from the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, where it's based, Geneva, Switzerland, to intervene proactively, to take positions with, and organize their members. Because, these bodies could confront members, for example, like ask UN members like Azerbaijan, Turkey, Georgia, other countries that, in the case of wrestling, where wrestling is also a national pastime, to intervene. Egypt is also a country, Turkey. I was working to get statements from Turkey. I'm sorry to revisit the topic that we started our conversation about, but it's still sort of circulating through my veins. And I tried to get comments from Turkey to intervene, or to about the wrestler Navid Afkari, and the Turks did not go on the record. And the Turks could have played an important role because it borders Iran. It's a very important country for wrestling. So if you get countries that border Iran and also have, are countries that are not part of the, that are viewed as not part of the Western world. Turkey's a very complex cat because we know it sort of has one foot in the Western world, one foot in the Middle East. It's always been in this sort of state of being a divided self. And we don't know where it's tending. Right now, we know it's tending in the direction of Russia and Iran and other authoritarian powers. But in the past, it was more pro-Western. So anyway, I'll end there. I think your viewers get the drift of my view on this organization.
I mean, that would take us to, when you're talking about the failure of international organizations and the hypocrisy, which will take us to the ICC in the latest decision to consider the Palestinians a state and then allow for complaints and accusations of war crimes. And when we actually know, and these are facts, that when Israel retaliates against Hamas, it's actually always with warnings, obviously not comparable to how Hamas fires missiles just randomly towards Israel, towards civilians in Israel. Not to mention that the ICC have failed to make any complaints or actually put on trial all of these world human rights violators, talking about the Assad regime in Syria, the Iranian regime, Venezuela. I mean, you can have a list, of all the dictatorships who've been actually murdering their people, who've been committing war crimes that are documented. And now they also want to put the United States accusations against the United States about Afghanistan. So what do you think of this? And it's just another example of that failed system that is actually present right now internationally.
Yeah, I think it's part of this whole zeitgeist, so to speak, of international entities and so-called human rights organizations failing to focus on closed and highly repressive societies and nations and devoting their resources to open democratic societies. I mean, what I'm saying is not anything novel or filled with any insights, but this has been the argument of, for example, someone I greatly admired, Robert Bernstein, who was the founder of Human Rights Watch, who wrote an op-ed going back over a decade in the New York Times criticizing Human Rights Watch for being, I think the title of the op-ed was Lost in the Middle East, because its current executive director, Ken Roth, spends his time slamming Israel at every opportunity he gets, while ignoring human rights violations in Syria, in Iran, etc. The ICC's decision to allow a prosecution of Israel and its decision to declare Palestine a state is, from a legal perspective, just completely flawed, because the disputed territories right now it does not constitute a state in terms of criteria. Mahmoud Abbas from the Palestinian Authority exercises control over a part of the disputed territory, but this is subject to right now negotiations between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, over the future of a Palestinian state. The actual prosecution of Israel for war crimes, as you mentioned, or crimes during its conflict with the US and EU designated terrorist organization Hamas that controls the Gaza Strip, is another story.
It murders the Palestinians in Gaza. That's
right.
what Hamas does.
Exactly, and the EU and the US have rightly classified Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization. And this is what Israel deals with on its southern border. And Hamas uses civilians as shields when Israel strikes back, as so-called human shields. The US, there is legislation that could deal with this, and it should be passed and enforced to combat Hamas's use of humans as shields during conflicts with Israel. It would be great if the ICC would actually tackle a real human rights crime, namely Hamas and Hezbollah's use also of human shields during conflicts. But
how they hide behind civilians on purpose, right?
Exactly.
So those are war crimes.
Exactly, and I mean, it's astonishing that all of the Russian air warfare against Syrian civilians and Assad's use of these barrel bombs that drop, barrels filled with nails and other, devices that explode and create massive damage on a very low level. They're dropped, so they're from helicopters and other forms, and all these types of war crimes.
In Russia, I mean, this is also Russia used the exact same. It's like blind bombs. They just kind of blindly bomb entire cities.
Yeah, exactly. And these types of war crimes are nowhere on the human rights and legal radar screen of the ICC. So again, I would hope that the Biden administration, does not delist the sanctions targeting the ICC officials, because the U.S. government, to its credit, during the Trump era, did sanction the ICC officials because the ICC wants to prosecute the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, for alleged war crimes in the Middle East. Again, it's for these organizations, it's all about, they have an intense preoccupation with Western liberal democracies that have advanced and modernized court systems that can deal with war crimes, that can deal with, so as Israel can. I mean, these are all legal systems in Israel, the United States, Britain, France, countries that have had military personnel in the Middle East. These judicial systems in these democracies are well equipped to deal with war crime allegations, or any other offenses of a criminal nature. Whereas, the Russia and Syria and Iran, and I mean, we can list, there's no shortage of countries where there are opaque systems of justice that are clearly very rudimentary in their development, and do not and have no real working sense of due process, are given a free pass by the ICC when they commit war crimes. So again, it's just the height of absurdity. You're dealing with another theater of the absurd, this time in the International Criminal Court, and it will continue unless there's unless, and I should add this, unless those contributors to the ICC, like Germany and Japan, which are some of the highest contributors, including the United Kingdom, decide, for example, tomorrow, we're going to pull out our funding unless you stop prosecuting democracies.
Exactly.
Democracies, and that hasn't happened. And I think Germany's spine and Japan's spine have been filled with jelly on this issue, and they're not willing to flex their muscles and say, we will stop funding you, that is the ICC, unless you stop perverting your mission.
And I hope that more and more people are, learning about this. Countries, as you mentioned, who are actually donors or support the ICC, that they make those decisions to not allow their funding to be used or misused in that way. Thank you so much, Benjamin Weinthal, on this great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you and learning about your great experience covering so many countries and your courageous efforts to help Iranian wrestlers and athletes. Thank you again for joining me today, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Havy. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you all for listening and watching. With you, Havy and The Untold, and I will see you next time.